My job this morning is to tell you about electronic cigarettes, and I'm going to try to convince you that they are a double-edged sword. They have both good and bad features, and during the presentation this morning I'll review what those are. So first let's start with the question, what is an electronic cigarette? And this slide shows us the essential components. They're made up of three different things. There's a battery, which heats an atomizer unit right here. And when the atomizer heats, it heats a liquid which contains nicotine. And that liquid can be drawn through the mouthpiece by a user. It creates a puff, which can be inhaled, and the nicotine is then delivered into the lungs of the e-cigarette user. The chamber here, which holds the liquid, can be refilled. So a user can buy bottles of what's called e-juice or refill fluid, and they can use this to fill the chamber repeatedly and use the e-cigarette over and over again. So they have a rather long lifetime compared to a traditional cigarette. How do electronic cigarettes differ from conventional cigarettes? Probably the most important thing is that conventional cigarettes burn tobacco. And when tobacco burns, there are thousands of chemicals that are created, many of which are quite toxic, some of which are carcinogenic. So there are thousands, probably on the order of 7,000 chemicals in conventional tobacco smoke. Electronic cigarettes heat nicotine solutions. They don't actually burn tobacco. They heat solutions of nicotine. And the aerosol has relatively few chemicals in it. And for this reason, you often hear people say that they are safer than conventional cigarettes. So let me introduce you to some electronic cigarettes. We'll talk a little bit about their evolution first. They're a product that's relatively new. They were introduced in, I think it was 2004. And the original cigarettes that were marketed looked like this. They were the three-piece units that I just described to you, with a battery, an atomizer, and a cartridge to hold the liquid. And about 2 years ago, these evolved into what's called the cartomizer style. The battery and the cartridge were fused together to form a cartomizer, which holds both the atomizer and the liquid. And these have since evolved into tank models. The tank model, notice, is much larger than the original e-cigarette. And it has a large tank on it. These are tanks down here in various different colors. And the tank holds the fluid that contains the nicotine. And the advantage of this particular style is that you can put a lot of fluid in it, and it doesn't have to be refilled very often. So these are quite popular, and actually a number of students here at UCR have been using the tank style e-cigarettes. They've evolved even further. About a year or so ago, many companies started to sell what are called disposable electronic cigarettes, and there's some shown here. These are individually wrapped in a package, and a user can buy a disposable e-cigarette, use it until it's gone, and then throw it out. So these are not refillable. They're intended to be used once and then tossed out. They cost approximately $7 to $8 a piece. Okay, and related to this are e-hookah sticks. These are really nothing more than electronic cigarettes with a different name. They're packaged differently, but if you dissect them and take them apart, they look internally just like an e-cigarette. They are a little bit different in that they generally have lower concentrations of tobacco in them, and they generally have different flavors, which are reminiscent of flavors that one would find in a hookah bar. So we've noticed that a number of students at UCR also are using this product. So there are also some exotic designs. Some electronic cigarettes don't even look like cigarettes. You might see somebody using something like this and not even realize what it is. This is actually an electronic cigarette, but it's disguised as an inhaler for somebody with asthma. And this, of course, is a Coke can with a straw in it. And you could probably easily imagine somebody walking around with one of these models, and you wouldn't even realize what they were doing, that they were vaping on an electronic cigarette. So there have been some very creative styles that have been produced recently. Now I wanted to talk a bit about the packaging of electronic cigarettes. Packaging in the cigarette world is very important, and identifying with the brand is very important. And you can see that some of the manufacturers, for example, E-Elites, have imitated the package of Marlboro Red. Marlboro Red being the #1 selling cigarette in the country. Notice the red and white design, how similar the packages look, so that a smoker might feel they're using their traditional brand by by switching to e-lights, e-cigarettes. Some of the packaging is much more exotic. The tank models can be purchased in little carrying cases that come complete with refill fluid and charging batteries and so forth. They're quite nicely made. They look very nice. And there are also some very glitzy styles of electronic cigarettes themselves. They come in many different colors, sizes, shapes, and so forth. So there's no such thing as an electronic cigarette. There are many, many different styles, models, kinds, and they perform and they behave differently. I mentioned before that electronic cigarettes are reusable, and this slide shows how that's done. You can buy these bottles of e-juice or refill fluid and open the top and then simply drip the fluid into an electronic cigarette. These are tank models here, but they're very easy to refill and they can be reused many times. Now these refill fluids are important. They come in many different flavors. There are hundreds, maybe thousands of different flavors of refill fluid. And some of those are shown here. Notice the flavors, they sound very attractive: coffee, chocolate, menthol, regular is tobacco, vanilla and so forth, juicy peach, strawberry, Coca-Cola. They even have flavors like fried egg and bacon, and some people use those. But there are literally thousands of flavors. Users often like these flavors. It's interesting to try different flavors. And some of the flavors, it's a little bit of a concern, are flavors that may appeal to young people or to children, such as bubble gum and even some of the flavors that are shown on this slide. I wanted to talk a little bit about advertising of e-cigarettes. This is actually a very important area. We could talk for the full 40 minutes on just this topic. But if you have been around long enough, you will remember the Marlboro Man, and probably many of us in this room do. This was considered one of the most successful advertisement campaigns ever in United States history. The Marlboro Man catapulted Marlboro cigarettes into the #1 position, and they have remained there ever since. He, of course, died long ago from lung cancer, but Marlboro remains the #1 selling cigarette in the country. It's very interesting that today we see a lot of the e-cigarettes advertised in a similar manner. I see a certain similarity between Stephen Dorff here and the Marlboro Man in the way he's cast in this advertisement. And if you've been watching television recently, you've probably seen him in TV ads promoting blue cigarettes. I'm not going to show you all the advertisement, but in addition to the Marlboro Man style ad, there are a number of very glitzy, glamorous ads that are also reminiscent of cigarette advertisement in the 50s and 60s. One more point about advertisement. There has been concern about truth in advertisement with respect to e-cigarettes. Just as an example, in ads last year, we often saw the ad would say something to the effect that it's only water vapor. And I just saw this actually on television last week in one TV show. They mentioned it was only water vapor. But we know that what is exhaled is not, or inhaled or exhaled, is not only water vapor. And I noticed when I was preparing for the talk today, it was hard finding this now in any of the ads. I think most of the manufacturers have taken this phraseology out of the ad because it's not correct. And instead they say something to the effect of no smoke, just pure vapor. Okay? So there has been a little bit of a correction there, but we could go through ads and find a number of errors in the current advertising. Just to introduce you to what's been happening in the field recently, Big Tobacco has stepped in. This was a very interesting change that took place about a year ago. Big Tobacco did not get involved in the e-cigarette field for quite a long time. They were sort of in the background, and people were wondering what they were going to do. They may have been waiting to see if e-cigarettes became popular or if it was just a boutique product or a flash in the pan. But in any case, I think they've decided there's a market here. And in 2012, Lorillard, which is the third largest American tobacco company, purchased Blue electronic cigarettes, and they've invested millions of dollars in marketing and evolving this product, and it has become the #1 selling electronic cigarette in the country. Right behind them, R.J. Reynolds this year came out with their own brand called Booze. Their slogan is "A perfect puff every time." And they're starting to market these in the United States in limited markets. Philip Morris came out in 2013 with the Mark 10s, so they have their own product. And British American Tobacco Company came out this year with Vipe. So all of the major players in big tobacco now have their own electronic cigarette product. They're going to have millions of dollars invested in marketing and promoting these products. So I think it's fair to say electronic cigarettes are here to stay. They're not going to go away. Big tobacco is in, and they will be here for the duration. Enjoy, I just wanted to point out, was the #1 cigarette until Lorillard bought Blue. Enjoy is an e-cigarette company. It's not owned by a tobacco company, but there has been some talk about perhaps one of the tobacco companies purchasing it. When we first started working with electronic cigarettes here at UC Riverside, we had to go onto the internet and order them and have them mailed into us. We couldn't find them very readily in local establishments. But that changed basically last year when Lorillard bought Blue. And I did this search just a few weeks ago, and I looked for places where we could buy Blue e-cigarettes within an 8-mile radius of UCR, and there were over 100 shops where we could go out and purchase them. So they're in all kinds of markets now. There's no problem buying them. They're readily available. Let's address the question, why do people use electronic cigarettes? There's several different reasons. One is to quit smoking. The idea is they're less dangerous than cigarettes. You could maybe switch to them and either smoke e-cigarettes or just quit completely by using lower and lower doses of nicotine in the cartridge. Some people, I think, try them because there's something new. It's a new gadget. It's a new electronic device, kind of like your iPad, and it's kind of cool, so they try them. Sometimes people that don't even smoke try them because they think they're kind of cool. Sometimes people smoke them, use them to reduce cigarette consumption, the idea being that maybe if they smoke a pack a day, they'll just cut back and smoke 10 cigarettes a day and then replace the 10 cigarettes with e-cigarettes. That happens actually quite frequently. And those individuals are called dual users, which is a new kind of cigarette smoker, somebody who's using 2 different products, e-cigarettes and regular cigarettes, at the same time. Not literally at the same time, but in the same lifetime. The other factor is that they tend to reduce costs. Once a person invests in e-cigarettes, the cost of filling the cartridge or buying a new one tends to be less than the cost of a regular cigarette. But we should also remember at this time they're not taxed, and if they are ever taxed in the future, the cost will probably go up significantly. So let's come back to quit smoking for a minute. This is one of the main reasons people advocate using electronic cigarettes. They claim that they will help people quit smoking. And it makes logical sense. They look like a cigarette. They can replace the hand-to-mouth addiction as well as the nicotine addiction. And people seem to feel like maybe they could use these to quit smoking. And a number of studies have been done recently to address this to see if they really work. And I'm going to just show you the data from one study that was published this September. The lead author on this was Chris Bullen. He's a very well-known person in the field, and he is a proponent of e-cigarette use. He comes from New Zealand, where they want to eliminate all smoking, tobacco smoking, by the year 2020. And they see e-cigarettes as the way to do this. So the Bullen Lab undertook a study. This is the largest clinical trial that has ever been undertaken with cessation and e-cigarettes. They had almost 700 participants who used either e-cigarettes or nicotine patches to try to quit smoking. And they published their results in Lancet this year, a very prestigious journal. And what they found was that the e-cigarettes were about equal to the nicotine patches. And they only worked in about 5 to 7% of the people that tried to quit using e-cigarettes. They were astounded, I'm sure, by this number. They expected it to be much higher, 30, 40, 50, 60%. And they were very surprised to learn that they were no more effective than nicotine patches. So it remains to be seen if electronic cigarettes are going to actually be a good cessation product. There's no question that some people have used them very successfully and have stopped smoking. But according to the data in the Bullen paper, this number may be very low. The percentage may be very low. What actually is in an e-cigarette? I'm going to take you through a little bit of technical information on what you can actually find inside one. They contain fluid, as I mentioned before, and the fluid contains humectants. These are usually propylene glycol and/or glycerin, and this is what makes the puff of vapor. They usually contain nicotine, although some of the products are sold without nicotine. They contain flavorings. We talked about those a minute ago. And then what the advertisements don't tell you is they also contain contaminants. And these contaminants can be organic chemicals, carcinogens, and metals. And I'll talk a little bit more about these in a minute. There is no regulation of the fluid in e-cigarettes or the refill fluid. These are not regulated by the FDA or any government agency. But it is interesting that the manufacturers themselves are starting to try to self-regulate, as often happens in industry when government has not stepped in to regulate. Everyone at this point is waiting for the FDA to regulate the products, but they haven't done so yet. Okay, so let's look a little bit more at what's inside a cigarette. I'm going to show you some work that our lab did. This is work of Monique Williams, who's a graduate student in my lab. She dissected a particular brand of electronic cigarettes to see what was inside them, and she did a lot of dissections of this brand, probably well over 30 different cartomizers. And this is what they look like inside. There's some metal components, and there's a filament here that heats up, and the heating of that filament is what causes the puff to form. But an interesting thing that we noticed is that these wrappings that go around the metal parts, there's an inner wrap and then there's an outer wrap of polyfill. These wrappings often had burn marks on them. Now these are supposed to heat, not burn, but they're heating hot enough to burn this fiber. And you can also see if you run electrophoretic gels, you'll recognize an electrophoresis band here. Maybe, Manuela, you've seen something like this in your lab. But these are like little electrophoresis units, and all the fluid has been concentrated in this one spot. So these were used before we opened them. They were sold in sealed packages, and an unused product, but we opened them, and this is what they looked like. They had clearly been used before we opened them. So we suspect that the company probably put them on a smoking machine and tested them before they marketed them. Some of them were used a lot. This is one, we didn't smoke it, we just opened it, and this is what it looked like. A lot of burn marks, and the burn actually scorched through to the outer fibers. And then some of them were also green in color. We had a couple of them that appeared to have some copper in them. She next took the fibers, the inner and the outer fibers, and she put them in a centrifuge tube, and she spun this tube down to separate the fluid from the fibers. These fibers, the job of these fibers is to hold the fluid close to the filament. And when she centrifuged them, she found a clear liquid. This would be the nicotine-containing liquid. And then at the bottom of the tube, there was a large pellet. This is a milligram-sized pellet, and it was usually black. And we spent a lot of time trying to figure out what this was and where it came from. And we finally took it over and did X-ray microanalysis on it and discovered this was a pellet of tin, solid tin. And if you take this out and you look at it with a scanning electron microscope, you can see tin particles in it. And if you look at these fibers over here, you can see that they are actually covered with tin. So this fluid that people are heating and inhaling is actually a very rich source of tin in this particular brand of e-cigarette. We wondered where the tin was coming from, and these products have solder joints. There are 4 solder joints that hold them together. So we went back and looked at the solder joints with SEM, and you can see one of them here. And I've had to become sort of an expert on what solder joints are supposed to look like when we started doing this. But I've been told that this is what looks like a cold joint. It doesn't look very well formed. There are bits of solder missing. And if we look at this area right here, it's comprised of what are called tin whiskers. And these tin whiskers were found not only on the solder joints, but also in the fluid. These are little filaments of tin. And they usually form when solder is not properly annealed to a surface. So we checked in China when they're not allowed to put lead in solder anymore. There was a law passed in China. So when they make solder, they make it without lead. And if there isn't lead in solder, it tends to be very poor quality and it starts falling apart. These products are generally made in China, and we think what's happening is they're not putting lead in the solder, but as the cigarette is used, this starts to decay and fall apart. And whiskers and tin particles then are transferred into the fluid. A couple other issues. This is a quality control issue that I just talked to you about, the appearance of metals in the fluid. Another quality control issue is that these products have been exploding in users' homes and cars. And while this was sort of rare a couple of years ago, it's actually becoming very common. And actually, before I came over here this morning, I actually found yet another report of one that blew up in Utah yesterday in somebody's home and scorched some of the furniture. But there have been some serious injuries due to exploding e-cigarettes in people's mouths when they were using them. And this gentleman you may remember from the news about a year ago from Florida. This is his picture before his e-cigarette exploded. His exploded while he was using it and knocked out most of his teeth and his tongue. And there have not been any pictures released of him since that accident happened. But they do have the ability to explode if they're overcharged. And this seems to be a problem that's becoming more common, not less common. So let's take a look now at what's inside the aerosol. So when a user takes a puff on an e-cigarette, there's aerosol created. And often we hear that that's only water vapor or water vapor with nicotine. But let's take a look at what actually is in the aerosol. First thing I wanted to tell you about, there is metal in the aerosol. So some of the metals that are present in the fluid actually pass into the aerosol, and some of these exist in the aerosol as nanoparticles. And so in our lab, Monique Williams did find chromium, nickel, and tin nanoparticles in aerosol from the cigarette that I showed you earlier. And these are of concern because nanoparticles are often more dangerous than larger particles of metals, and users are inhaling these, getting these into their lungs, and we don't yet know what the ramifications of this are, but I think it is something to be concerned about. We need to know more about what these nanoparticles are actually doing to the health of one's lungs. There also are a number of other chemicals that are present in e-cigarette aerosol. They're not just water vapor, and this is a list of some of the ones that have been reported in aerosol by various different laboratories. And the ones that are shown in yellow are on an FDA list, which is called Harmful and Potentially Harmful Substances List. So the things that are in yellow are thought by the FDA to be harmful substances. And these are present in electronic cigarettes. And I would point out that a number of these are carcinogens, NNN, NNK, benzene is a carcinogen, formaldehyde, just to give a couple of examples. So there are carcinogens in e-cigarette aerosol. They're generally present in lower concentrations than in tobacco smoke, but they do exist. Okay, now I'm going to tell you a little bit more about this particular class of carcinogens. These are called tobacco-specific nitrosamines. These are one of the chemicals that we worry about most in cigarette smoke. This is a paper that I thought was actually very interesting. It came out in 2013. And these authors took 105 different electronic cigarette products. 105 is a lot. And they analyzed the tobacco-specific nitrosamines in each one of them. And they created this graph showing for each of the 105 cigarettes how many tobacco-specific nitrosamines they contained. So they've stacked each of these nitrosamines into a column for each product. And just by quickly inspecting this graph, you can see a couple of things. First of all, some of the products have almost no levels of nitrosamine. So if you were to analyze only the products here, you would think the levels were very low. But if you were to analyze the products here, you'd think the levels were many times higher. Okay, so that's one thing that we learned from this analysis. The other is that the relative abundance of each one of these is variable within different products. Okay? Some have a lot of NNN, some don't have very much. Some have a lot of total tobacco-specific nitrosamines, some have very few. So there's a huge variability within products, and users who buy these and puff on them don't know themselves what they're getting or what they're actually being exposed to. So this is, I think, something important from the user's perspective. It would be nice if we had better quality control on these products so that people who are using them have a safer product that's not delivering this kind of tobacco-specific nitrosamine, but is delivering lower levels. So one of the questions that always comes up with e-cigarettes is, do they cause cancer or do they cause less cancer than traditional cigarettes? And that's a hard question to answer, and we're probably not going to know the answer for many years. And the reason for that is shown in this slide. We're looking here at the number of persons who smoked, number of men who smoked traditional cigarettes, starting in 1900 and going out to about 1940. And you can see there's a huge increase in the number of men in the United States that smoked regular cigarettes, tobacco-containing cigarettes during this time. And the reason for that is they became readily available. There were machines that could roll cigarettes, so men could buy them. And there was a lot of advertisement that was involved in promoting them. So this curve increased very dramatically in this 40-year period. This is the occurrence of lung cancer in men from 1920 out to about 1960. And you see it follows the cigarette curve up very nicely, but they're separated by roughly 20 years. And the reason for that is if you smoke a package of cigarettes, you don't drop dead the next day. You might get cancer in 20 years, but it doesn't affect you immediately. So it took 20 years to see cancer developing in these men who were smoking. Okay, so if someone switched today to e-cigarettes, are they going to be, or if they start smoking e-cigarettes today, are they going to be getting lung cancer or not? Well, we won't know for about 20 years. So we have to wait a long time, and we have to do some long-range studies before we actually know whether we're going to see any change in this lung cancer curve due to e-cigarettes. We might. They might not be as dangerous. This might go down. It might disappear. It might be just as bad, or it might be even worse. We don't know at this time. What's an e-cigarette exhale? People who use e-cigarettes do exhale large puffs of aerosol, and there isn't a lot that's been done on this, but there is one paper by Schripp that's come out, and these authors found that there are the humectants, propylene glycol and glycerol, flavorings, and nicotine. Nicotine is part of the exhale. And then there are a number of other chemicals like acetone, formaldehyde, acetaldehyde. These are organic chemicals that tend to be toxic, and some of them are carcinogens. So the exhale is not just water vapor, but it does have other chemicals in it, including ultrafine particles or nanoparticles. So these are things that people who are not using e-cigarettes might be concerned about, because if you were in a room with somebody exhaling, you would be exposed to these. These are going to settle down on surfaces. So if we smoke an e-cigarette in a room like this, that aerosol is going to settle and collect on these surfaces and form what's called third-hand aerosol. And third-hand aerosol could be very important because some of the chemicals I mentioned to you are carcinogens, and nicotine has the potential, when it's on a surface such as this, to be converted into a tobacco-specific nitrosamine or a carcinogen. And Manuela Martins-Green will talk more about this later, I think, in her talk. But we do need to be concerned about what's exhaled from an e-cigarette user, because there is the potential for this exhale to coat the environment in which it exists, and there is the potential for that exhale to contain carcinogens in it. This is not an area that's been studied very much, but it does need to be looked into, because there are many places trying to decide now, many governments trying to decide if they should allow these to be used indoors or not. And the content of the aerosol and what happens to it after it's exhaled would be important issues in addressing that topic. Let me talk for a few minutes now about the health effects of e-cigarettes on people. We know that smoking is dangerous, and if you smoke, your lungs are going to be greatly affected by the tar and so forth that's in tobacco smoke. What do we know about e-cigarettes and how they affect human health? So I'm going to show you a couple of studies that address that. The first study is one that was done in my lab by a number of graduate students. And in this particular study, we looked at the cytotoxicity of refill fluids. So these are the little bottles of fluid that you buy to refill e-cigarettes. And we examined the cytotoxicity of these. Cytotoxicity is the ability to kill cells. In other words, we were asking, can these fluids kill cells or not? And we sometimes refer to something called an IC50 in this work, which is a dose that kills half the cells. So the purpose of this study was to compare relative cytotoxicity of various refill fluid products. We bought a lot of products, and we wanted to see how their cytotoxicity compared. And then we wanted to determine if the cytotoxicity varied with different cell types. So we tested 3 different types of cells with these products. This study was motivated by users who contacted us and said that they were using certain products, not all of them, but certain products seemed to be making them ill, and they wanted us to check and see if some of the products were cytotoxic and some were not. So we screened 41 different products from different manufacturers, and this is a table that summarizes that data. And I don't expect you to read this. All I want you to realize is that the color coding indicates the level of cytotoxicity. The products that were up here had low cytotoxicity or no cytotoxicity. These were moderately cytotoxic, and these were highly cytotoxic. So what this screen is telling us is that e-cigarette products vary tremendously in their cytotoxicity. Some seem to have no cytotoxicity. Some will kill cells very readily. Okay? And I wanted to show you one more bit of data from this paper, which we thought was interesting. We looked at 4 different companies, And all of the companies had some products that were highly cytotoxic. So we weren't able to go to a user and say, buy everything from company X because all of their products seem to be non-cytotoxic. All the companies had some products that were cytotoxic. And the products varied over the 3 ranges of cytotoxicity. On this graph, anything up here is non-cytotoxic, anything here is moderate, and anything down here is highly cytotoxic. So for Freedom Smoke, this is a company that sells these cigarette refill fluids. You can see some of their products were fine, some of them were in the toxic zone. Okay? An interesting thing about another company, Johnson Creek, was that when we looked at 3 different cell types, human embryonic stem cells, human pulmonary fibroblasts, and mouse neural stem cells, so 2 stem cell types and an adult cell, we found that almost all the products from Johnson Creek were not cytotoxic to the lung. All these lung cells are fine, not bothered at all by Johnson Creek. But the 2 stem cell populations found these products highly cytotoxic. And I think that this is a very important point. For some reason that we do not yet understand, the Johnson Creek products are killing stem cells. We have stem cells in our bodies, in our lungs, other places. We don't know yet if the effect is similar in adult stem cells, but if it is, this would be a reason for concern, because it would not be good to be using these products and killing your stem cells. What happens if you run out of stem cells? You die, okay? It's not a good situation. Now I'm going to give you one more example of a study that was done with humans, and this is a study that also came out of my lab, and it was done by a very talented undergraduate named Crystal Hua. And in this particular study, we took an infodemiological approach to ask the question, what kind of symptoms are e-cigarette users reporting, both positive and negative? And we did this by going to the internet, and we looked at forums on the internet where e-cigarette users reported positive and negative symptoms that they attributed to their e-cigarette use. So we found in the course of mining this data almost 500 different users, and they reported a total of about 405 different symptoms, much higher than we were expecting actually. And of those, 78 were positive symptoms, in other words, something improved by switching to e-cigarettes, and about 326 were negative symptoms, something got worse because they switched to e-cigarettes. Now I feel that a limitation of this study is that we are probably underestimating positives here, and the reason for that I think is people are more likely to write into something and complain if they're not feeling well than they are to write in and report if they're feeling better. So there probably are more positive symptoms that have not been reported. But one of the things that surprised us when we did this study was how many different body systems, organ systems in the body, were actually affected. So this is what's called an association diagram. And in this diagram, we've taken each symptom, positive and negative, and we have associated it with an organ system in the body. So every red dot, and I don't expect you to read these, they're way too tiny, okay? Every red dot is a negative symptom, something that was negative that a person attributed to e-cigarette use, and every green dot is a positive symptom. And these are associated with the respiratory system, mouth and throat, neurological, sensory, and so forth. And we were surprised that so many different systems were affected by e-cigarette use. Digestive, for example, had a number of effects. Skeletal muscle had a number of effects. So we had, I think in total, 12 different systems in the body where people reported positive or negative effects due to e-cigarette use. I'm going to show you these two at higher mag now so we can see a little bit more about what they say. So for the respiratory system and the mouth and throat were the 2 systems that were most affected in these e-cigarette users, and it's not too surprising. The mouth and the throat and the respiratory system are the prime targets of the aerosol. But you can probably read some of these and see what some of the problems are. Burning mouth, for example, dry tongue. There were a lot of problems with tongue, throat, mouth. Some people reported positive things, improved irritated throat, for example. So there were some improvements, but by and large the problems that were reported were negative. Now we've taken all of these negative symptoms and we put them together into an interactome, and I wanted to show you that last. So this is a way to view all of the data and all of the negative symptoms in one figure. Each one of these little nodes is a system in the body, respiratory, mouth and throat. And each little round dot is a person, one of the individuals in the study. And the people are color-coded by the number of symptoms that they reported. So the people that reported one symptom are shown in red, and they're grouped on the outside of the interactome, and you can see which systems they were reporting their problem in. The people in teal, that would be these dots here, each had two symptoms. They had two problems that they encountered as a result of e-cigarette use, and this allows us to see some interaction between organ systems. So people that had problems with the respiratory system also had problems with their mouth and throat. And you can see a number of interactions as you trace around the interactome. The other thing that I'd like to point out here is that some people had as many as 6 different symptoms, and those people are shown in bright green. You can see them right here, and if you trace the lines out from those, you will find that they go to 6 different organ systems. So we can get a lot of information about how these products are affecting people by taking this kind of approach. But we certainly do see that there are some health effects. These are by and large what I would call short-term health effects, and we need to have actually far more work on this kind of thing, as well as the long-term studies that need to be started. The title of my talk today was E-Cigarettes, a Double-Edged Sword, and I just want to review a couple of the things that I've spoken about to tell you what the positives and negatives are. E-cigarettes are certainly here to stay. Big tobacco is in the field right now, and we're going to see a lot more of e-cigarettes in the future. Some of the positives: they definitely have fewer chemicals than traditional cigarettes, many, many fewer chemicals. They have tobacco-specific nitrosamines, but in general those levels are lower than they are in conventional cigarettes. They may help people quit smoking, but the recent study that I mentioned from Lancet indicated that they're not particularly effective in doing this. They certainly have helped some people. They may not be as helpful as we once thought. They may be safer than conventional cigarettes. That's often said that they are, but they may have their own set of risks, and we don't really know what those risks are yet. We don't know the short-term and the long-term health effects very well. One thing we do know is they do not produce any side stream smoke. There is third-hand aerosol, but there's no side stream smoke. Okay? On the negative side, some of the refill fluids and flavorings are cytotoxic, as we know from the study that I showed you. There's concern about these being a gateway product. They come in very attractive flavors and colors and designs, and the CDC recently published a paper expressing concern that many very young people, junior high, high school, who were not smokers were using electronic cigarettes. That could open up the possibility of them smoking traditional cigarettes in the future. So there is concern about them being a gateway product. Some of them appear to be targeted to children. British American Tobacco Company just recently accidentally put an ad in a child's magazine. They apologized for doing that, but there does seem to be some targeting to children. We know people take longer puffs and they puff harder often on e-cigarettes, and it's not clear how that will affect the physiology of the respiratory system. It's very clear that quality control needs to be improved, as we can see from the tin pellets that were present in that one brand that I showed you. There have been numerous health effects that have been reported by e-cigarette users. We need to understand what these are better. Some of them were actually quite serious, and some of them were debilitating. I didn't tell you about the ones that were the most serious, but there is some concern here that there could be adverse health effects that are not understood by users. But certainly the long-term health effects are not understood, and they won't be for many years. As I mentioned before, there is a third-hand aerosol which is produced by these products, and its effects are not yet known. And there's currently no federal regulation on e-cigarettes. We're hoping, I think even many users are hoping that this comes soon, so they would have a product that would be safer for them to use, better controlled. But the FDA has been very slow in bringing about any regulation. Our lab does a lot of outreach with respect to smoking, and we're happy to do this. If anyone would like to contact us with questions about electronic cigarettes, which ones might be safer than others, we would be happy to talk to you and work with you. We also have several projects that are ongoing that involve using many students here at UCR who are e-cigarette users or staff, and I would like to just mention that these projects are ones where we're recruiting, and we would certainly welcome anyone to participate in this research. We're trying to get a better understanding of the product and trying to figure out ways to improve it, since it is probably going to be with us for a long time. If you have any questions or you have any need for outreach or you would like to participate in any of our projects, please don't hesitate to contact me. My email is very easy. It's just my last name, Talbot, at ucr.edu. And then finally, I would like to thank all of the students in my lab who actually did the work that I reported to you that came from our lab, and also the funding agencies and Evan Snyder for providing some of the cells. Thank you very much for inviting me to be here today.